My name is Sarah Miller. I'm 46 years old, and I've been a head nurse at New York Presbyterian for over 2 decades. For 3 years, I drove 2 hours every morning to care for my mother-in-law, Eleanor Vance, a billionaire and cancer patient. I managed her medications, her doctors, her fear. I stayed 48 hours straight in the oncology ward while her daughters were asking for new cars. Then one morning, I found a document in the trash. Eleanor had changed her legal medical proxy secretly. My 3 years of authority had been transferred to my sister-in-law Tiffany. I brought it to my husband Mark. He didn't look up from his laptop. She's a mogul, Sarah. Don't make it a thing. I put the document down. 1 week later, Eleanor held a celebration dinner for her full remission. She stood and raised her glass. She thanked her daughters for their love. Then she turned to me and to Sarah for being such a dedicated employee. We've arranged a generous severance for your caregiving services. Tiffany slid a check across the table. It's time for the real family to move on. You understand, don't you? I looked at Mark. He was staring at his plate. He didn't look up. He said nothing. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't sudden. Mark had known from the beginning. 3 years of 5 a.m. drives, 48-hour vigils, holding her hand through every round of chemo. All of it reduced to one check. I wasn't an employee. I stood up. My chair scraped the floor. The restaurant went silent. I was your daughter. I pushed the check back. And I walked out. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. 3 days later, I drove to the estate to collect my things. Black trash bags lined the driveway. My belongings. The key no longer worked, the locks had been changed. I opened my banking app. The joint account was at zero. Mark had withdrawn everything. In the mailbox was a court filing submitted by Tiffany. Grounds: Sarah Miller is mentally unstable and unfit for medical decision-making. 3 years as a nurse. That was how it ended. But there was one thing they missed. My proxy access to Eleanor's medical records had never been revoked. One day, an automated notification came through. I opened the file. 20 years of trained eyes read the scan. They had taken Eleanor to Europe. A cruise. 2 weeks later, Mark called. The alarm on Sarah Miller's phone went off at 4:45 in the morning, the same as it had every day for the past 3 years. She didn't groan. She didn't pull the pillow over her face the way she used to when she was younger and the body still had the luxury of protest. She simply reached over in the dark, silenced it with a practiced thumb, and sat up on the edge of the mattress. The apartment in Queens was small, 2 bedrooms that shared a wall thin enough to hear the neighbor's television. A kitchen where the overhead light buzzed no matter how many times the bulb was changed. A bathroom with a cracked tile above the toilet that she kept meaning to fix. It was clean, though. Meticulously so. Sarah had learned early in her nursing career that clean spaces were a form of control. A way of ordering the world when everything else felt like it was sliding sideways. She moved through the morning routine without turning on more lights than necessary. Coffee, black, scrubs laid out the night before, folded over the back of the chair. A granola bar for the drive because there would be no time for anything else. She checked her phone while the coffee brewed. One message from the night charge nurse at New York Presbyterian about a patient transition. 3 emails she would deal with during her break, and a calendar reminder: Eleanor morning meds, 7 a.m. sharp, as if she could forget. The drive from Queens to the Hamptons took just under 2 hours when traffic cooperated, longer when it didn't. Sarah had made it so many times that she could navigate it half asleep, which, on certain mornings, she essentially was. She knew every exit, every stretch of highway where the radio signal dipped and cut out, every rest stop where the coffee was worth pulling over for. She knew this route the way she knew Eleanor's pill schedule, the way she knew the sound of Eleanor's breathing when it was labored versus when it was simply restless. She knew it by heart, because she had given it her heart. The Vance estate sat at the end of a long gravel drive lined with oak trees that had been there longer than anyone living could remember. In autumn they were magnificent, that particular shade of amber that made the whole property look like a painting. In summer they provided shade that made the house feel cool even before you stepped inside. Sarah had noticed these things in her first weeks there, when everything about the estate still carried the weight of novelty. Now she noticed them the way she noticed her own heartbeat, registered, catalogued, and filed away without ceremony. She let herself in through the side entrance with her key and set her bag down in the mudroom. The house had its own particular smell in the mornings, before the housekeeper arrived. And before Eleanor was fully awake, something between old wood and expensive candles and the faint antiseptic undertone that had crept in over the past 3 years, the smell of a body being carefully managed. Lavender, mostly. Eleanor had expensive taste in candles, the kind that came in heavy glass containers and cost more than Sarah's weekly grocery bill. The kitchen was immaculate. Sarah filled the pill organizer from the locked cabinet. She had a key to that, sorting each medication into its compartment with the automatic precision of someone who had done it thousands of times. Beta blockers, anti-nausea, the post-treatment supplements that Eleanor's oncologist had added to the regimen 6 months ago. She knew the dosages, the interactions, the window of time in which each needed to be taken relative to food. She knew which ones made Eleanor's hands tremble slightly, and which ones, taken on an empty stomach, would have her calling from the bathroom 20 minutes later. She was refilling the water pitcher when she saw it. It was tucked under a spread of magazines on the marble counter. The kind of glossy socialite publications that appeared in Eleanor's house the way weather happened, naturally and constantly, without anyone seeming to put them there. A folded sheet of paper, cream-colored and official-looking, with the blue header of a Medicare explanation of benefits statement. Sarah would not have noticed it at all except that it had slipped halfway out from under the stack, and her eye caught the column of service dates. She didn't mean to read it. She had no reason to read it. But her eyes processed information quickly. 20 years of nursing had hardwired that response, and in the 2 seconds it took her to register what she was looking at. She saw 3 line items for services rendered at a facility she didn't recognize, billed under Eleanor's primary coverage, for dates when Sarah herself had been the one managing Eleanor's care. Services she hadn't authorized, services she hadn't arranged, services that, as far as she knew, hadn't happened at all. She set the water pitcher down carefully. The magazine on top of the stack had a glossy cover featuring a woman in a white dress at some charity gala. Sarah straightened the stack without disturbing the statement beneath it, the way you might move something fragile without acknowledging you touched it at all. Behind her, Eleanor's phone buzzed on the marble counter. Sarah turned. The screen lit briefly, a notification from what appeared to be a private banking application, the icon. Small and elegant, the text truncated but legible enough to catch the words transfer confirmation and a figure she couldn't fully read before Eleanor's voice came from the hallway. Sarah. It wasn't a greeting. It was an announcement. Eleanor Vance moved with the deliberate slowness of a woman who had learned to conserve her energy without sacrificing her authority. She was 72 years old and had survived a cancer diagnosis that, by certain statistics, she had no business surviving. She was thin in the way that illness made some people thin, not frail. But distilled, as though everything non-essential had been burned away and what remained was pure will. Her robe was silk, her hair was already set. Her eyes, which were a particular shade of gray that Sarah had always privately thought of as the color of lake water, before a storm, moved from the counter to Sarah's face with an expression that was impossible to read. She crossed the kitchen in 3 measured steps and picked up her phone, turning the screen face down against the counter without looking at it. "You're checking my mail now, Sarah?" she asked. Her voice was light. It was always light when it was at its most dangerous, smooth and cool, like cold silk drawn slowly through closed fingers. Sarah had learned this, too, in 3 years. The warmth in Eleanor Vance's voice was a performance. The cold was the truth. "I was making your coffee," Sarah said. "I noticed it had slipped out from the stack." Eleanor opened a cabinet and retrieved her preferred mug bone china, pale blue. The only item in the kitchen that appeared to have any personal significance to her. She poured her coffee herself, not because Sarah wasn't there to do it, but because she always did. It was one of the small ways Eleanor reminded everyone in her orbit that her independence was not up for negotiation. The silence stretched between them, warm and slightly humid in the way of summer mornings in that house. Filled with the sound of birds outside and the faint traffic noise from the road and nothing else. Sarah placed the completed pill organizer on its usual spot at the edge of the counter. Eleanor's phone buzzed again. This time Eleanor moved to it immediately, swept it up, and turned away slightly as she read whatever the notification said. The motion was quick, not rushed, but deliberate. Controlled. The way you move when you don't want someone to see your face. Sarah dried her hands on the small dish towel hanging from the oven handle and looked out the window over the sink at the oak trees in the morning light. A cardinal sat in the upper branches of the nearest one, perfectly still, watching nothing in particular. She had told herself many times over the past 3 years that she was lucky to have this position. She had told herself that Eleanor trusted her, that the trust between a patient and a caregiver was something sacred and real. Built from the most vulnerable moments a person could offer another. She had stayed the nights Eleanor was afraid. She had held the hand that reached out in the dark oncology ward. She had learned the medications and the symptoms and the routines and the particular, specific language of this one woman's body. And she had done all of it because she believed it mattered. Because she believed she was not an employee but something closer. She stood at the window with her hands damp from the dish towel and the cardinal watching from its branch and the smell of lavender and antiseptic and expensive coffee filling the room, and she thought for the first time, but not with any certainty, the way you think something for the first time only in retrospect, that the paper under the magazines was something she was meant to have been kept from seeing. The pill organizer sat on the counter in its neat little row, each compartment carefully filled. Eleanor scrolled through her phone at the kitchen island, her back slightly angled away from where Sarah stood. The cardinal flew off. The kitchen held its breath. I told myself I was overreacting, Sarah thought, lifting her bag from the mudroom hook and moving toward the hallway to begin the morning routine. That she was just protective of her privacy. That 3 years of this much closeness made people strange in ways that didn't mean anything. She paused at the threshold between the mudroom and the kitchen and looked back once. Eleanor had not moved. The phone was still in her hand. The pill organizer sat untouched. I told myself that the document was not something Sarah went looking for. That was the part she would return to later, in the sleepless hours. When the mind insists on reconstructing every moment with the precision of a crime scene investigator. She hadn't been searching through Eleanor's things. She hadn't been suspicious in any actionable way, only that low, persistent hum of unease. That she had been dismissing for weeks as the natural paranoia of someone who spent too many hours alone in a house that wasn't hers. She had been straightening the study. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning, and Eleanor had gone to a luncheon in the city with women whose names Sarah recognized from the society pages. The kind of women who wore jewelry in the daytime without irony and referred to charitable giving in the same tone they used to discuss restaurants. The housekeeper was off. The house was quiet in that particular way of large, expensive houses when they're empty, not silent. Exactly, but aware, as though the walls themselves were listening for footsteps. Sarah had been collecting the coffee cups Eleanor left in the various rooms she drifted through during the day. There was always at least one in the study, usually on the corner of the mahogany desk near the window, where Eleanor liked to sit and look out at the garden while she made calls. Sarah had reached around the leather wastebasket to retrieve it, and that was when she saw it. A document, folded once and creased, resting on top of the otherwise empty wastebasket as though it had been placed there deliberately. Or perhaps dropped without a second thought. The kind of thing you throw away when you've finished with it. The kind of thing that wasn't meant to be read by anyone else. She almost left it there. She picked up the coffee cup. She straightened the coaster. She took one step back toward the hallway. And then she stopped. The corner of the document was visible above the rim of the wastebasket, and on it, in the clean serif font of a legal letterhead, she could read 3 words: power of attorney. She set the coffee cup down. The document was 4 pages, standard legal weight paper, with the kind of careful language that meant nothing until it meant everything. She read it the way she read medical charts, quickly, systematically, looking for the information that mattered and filtering out the procedural language around it. She found what she was looking for on page 2. Eleanor Constance Vance hereby revokes all prior powers of attorney and designates Tiffany Elaine Vance as sole agent with full authority over all financial, medical, and legal decisions. Effective immediately. The signature at the bottom was Eleanor's. The date was 11 days ago. Sarah stood in the empty study with the document in her hands and the garden visible through the window behind the desk. The summer light falling across the lawn in long, warm strips, and tried to understand what she was holding. For 3 years, she had been the one with medical authority. She had been the one the doctors called when Eleanor was in the hospital. She had been the one who sat across from the oncologist in that small office, with the diplomas on the wall, and took notes and asked the questions that Eleanor was too frightened to ask herself. That had been real. She was certain of that. Whatever else was uncertain, that had been real. She folded the document exactly as she had found it and placed it back in the wastebasket. That evening, she drove back to Queens in the particular silence of a person who has been handed information they don't know what to do with yet. The city came back around her, the density of it, the noise, the way Queens felt like a different planet from the Hamptons. All the familiar chaos of her actual life reasserting itself after a day in Eleanor's carefully curated world. Mark was at the kitchen table when she got home, his laptop open and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was in his consultant clothes still, jacket on the back of the chair, tie loosened, the particular posture of a man who had been at his desk all day and hadn't moved enough. He looked up when she came in, offered a brief smile, and looked back at the screen. Sarah set her bag down. She poured herself a glass of water. She stood at the sink for a moment looking at the faucet. "Mark," she said, "why would your mother change the legal guardian status without telling us?" The typing didn't stop immediately. It slowed, then stopped. Mark took off his reading glasses. "What? The POA? She's changed it. Tiffany is the sole agent now. I found the document in the wastebasket in the study." There was a pause. Not a long one, 3, maybe 4 seconds, but the kind of pause that has weight to it. The kind that tells you the person on the other end of the conversation already knew what you were about to say. "She's a mogul, Sarah." He put his glasses back on. His fingers returned to the keyboard. "She manages her assets. Don't make it a thing." The faucet dripped. A small, metallic sound, rhythmic and indifferent. Sarah set her water glass down on the counter and looked at her husband's profile, the familiar lines of his face, the slight furrow at his brow that was always there now, when he was working, or when he was pretending to work. He was a handsome man, Mark Vance. He had his mother's jaw and his father's eyes. And he had the particular quality of people who had grown up with money of seeming at all times to belong exactly where they were. Comfortable in his skin in a way that had once seemed like confidence and now seemed, in certain lights, like indifference. Her eyes moved to the refrigerator. It was not the first time she had noticed the paper. It had been there for at least a week, held up by one of the generic magnets that accumulate on refrigerator doors without anyone putting them there intentionally. A sunflower, a pizza place they'd ordered from once. She had noticed it the way you notice things that your brain has decided not to process yet. But standing here now, in the fluorescent buzz of the kitchen, with the faucet dripping and her husband refusing to meet her eyes, she read it properly for the first time. A penalty notice. A 401k early withdrawal. Significant figures. She looked at the paper for a long moment. Then she looked at her husband. "Mark, it's handled, Sarah." "That's not. It's handled." He said it again, the same tone, the kind of tone that closes a door rather than invites a conversation. His eyes stayed on the laptop screen. You've been at Mom's all day. You must be tired. There's food in the fridge. Sarah looked at the withdrawal notice one more time. The amount was not small. She thought about the trips his sisters had taken recently, Tiffany's new gallery space on the Upper East Side, Chloe's wellness retreat in Sedona that she had documented with the particular aggressive cheerfulness of people who needed everyone to know they were thriving. She thought about the dinner conversations over the past year where certain things had been discussed just out of her earshot, where conversations stopped when she entered rooms. She thought about the document in the wastebasket. Is my marriage just another transaction in this family? The thought arrived fully formed and then immediately felt too large to hold. She pressed it back down. The faucet dripped again. She gripped the counter edge not tightly, not visibly, just the slight pressure of 10 fingertips against cold laminate, and breathed. The refrigerator hummed. The penalty notice hung on its sunflower magnet, swaying slightly in the air conditioning. I'll heat up the leftovers, she said. Mark made a small sound of acknowledgement that meant nothing in particular and went back to his typing. Sarah moved to the refrigerator and opened it and looked at the containers stacked on the shelves, each one labeled in her own handwriting, and thought about the years she had spent organizing things: pill organizers and legal documents and dinner rotations and medical schedules for a family that had apparently been reorganizing itself all along, in documents she wasn't meant to find and conversations she wasn't meant to hear. She took out the leftover soup and set it on the stove. The burner clicked to life. Suspicion is a slow poison, she thought, stirring the soup in slow circles, watching it begin to move. And I had just swallowed the first drop. The invitation had arrived the week before in the form of a text message from Tiffany, which was itself a statement. Not a call, not a handwritten note of the kind Eleanor still sent on certain occasions because she believed email was for people without manners. A text, brief and businesslike, informing Sarah and Mark that there would be a family dinner at the River Cafe on Friday evening to celebrate Eleanor's complete remission and the closing of a land development deal that Tiffany described, without apparent irony, as transformative. The word family was doing considerable work in that message. Sarah wore the blue dress she kept for occasions that required she look like she belonged somewhere she wasn't entirely sure she belonged. It was a good dress, simple, well-fitted, the kind of blue that was dark enough to be serious and light enough not to be severe. She'd had it for 4 years. It still fit. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror and put on small pearl earrings and thought about how many dinners she had attended as the wife of Mark Vance, orbiting Eleanor's world like a planet that was always slightly outside the designated solar system. Mark straightened his tie in the mirror beside her. He looked, as he always did for his family's events, exactly right: the jacket that was perfectly cut, the watch his father had left him, the easy manner of a man attending an occasion he'd been attending his entire life. Ready? He said. Yes, she said. The River Cafe sat under the Brooklyn Bridge like it had been there since before the bridge itself. All white tablecloths and warm light and windows looking out at the East River and the Manhattan skyline beyond it. On a clear evening in July it was, genuinely, beautiful. The kind of place where the setting did half the emotional work for you and the kitchen did the rest. Sarah had been there twice before, both times for Vance family occasions. And both times she had felt that particular friction of being in a place that was designed to make you feel the full weight of what you could not afford. The table was already occupied when they arrived. Eleanor sat at its head, of course she did, in a deep burgundy dress that made her look precisely as formidable as she intended. Her diamond necklace caught the candlelight and threw small spectra across the white linen. She looked well, better than she had looked in months, actually, the color back in her cheeks in a way that the treatments had stripped away for so long. Complete remission. Sarah had been there for the oncologist's appointment where those words were spoken. She had sat 3 chairs away from Eleanor in that small office and felt something genuine and uncomplicated relief. Simple and complete because she had spent 3 years willing this woman toward survival. Tiffany sat to Eleanor's right, her posture the practiced ease of someone who had grown up at tables like this one. She was wearing a jacket the color of champagne, tailored within an inch of its life. And she had the particular expression of someone who has arranged an event and is monitoring its execution with proprietary attention. Beside her, Chloe was already on her second glass of wine by the look of it. Her jewelry competing aggressively with her sister's, her laugh directed at something on her phone carrying a fraction too far across the intimate space of the table. They both looked up when Sarah and Mark arrived. Tiffany's smile was the kind that reached the middle of the face and stopped there. Mark, she rose slightly to accept his embrace. Sarah, a nod, no embrace. She sat back down with the smooth efficiency of someone closing a parenthesis. Chloe didn't look up from her phone. They sat. Menus were placed in front of them. The waiter recited the evening specials with the gentle authority of someone who did this many times a night and believed in it every time. Eleanor ordered the halibut. Mark ordered a steak. Sarah ordered something she would barely taste. For the first hour, the dinner was what such dinners always were, the family performing its version of itself. The conversation moving through the real estate deal in broad, confident strokes. Tiffany outlining the particulars of the development agreement with the satisfaction of someone who had closed something significant and wanted the table to know exactly how significant. The land was in New Jersey, $50 million, a consortium of investors that Eleanor's name had anchored. It was, by any measure, an impressive piece of business. Sarah listened. She asked a question at one point about the timeline that was answered briefly and redirected. She refilled her water glass. She watched the lights on the river through the window. The East River moved in the dark outside, the current visible in the way the reflected lights shivered across its surface. The bridge pylons rose into the warm summer night, solid and permanent, holding things up. Eleanor waited until the main course had been cleared. She rose from her chair with the measured deliberation of a woman who had spent decades commanding rooms, and the table went quiet. The way tables go quiet when the person at the head of it stands. "I want to say a few words," Eleanor began, her voice carrying the particular resonance of long practice. 3 years ago, I sat in a hospital room and heard a word that none of us want to hear. And I want to say tonight, with all of you here, that I am grateful. Grateful to be sitting at this table. Grateful for the deal that closed this week. And most grateful. She paused, and her eyes moved to Tiffany, and then to Chloe, warm and deliberate, to my daughters. For their emotional support. For being present. For reminding me what it means to have real family. Tiffany smiled. Chloe pressed her hand to her chest. Sarah held her wine glass and waited. Eleanor's eyes moved to her then, and something shifted in them, a slight adjustment, the way a camera refocuses, the warmth cooling by a single degree. "And to Sarah," Eleanor said. Her voice remained smooth, unhurried. She smiled the smile of someone delivering a compliment that is not a compliment. "For being such a dedicated employee. We've arranged a generous severance for your caregiving services. You've given us a great deal of time, and the family wants to make sure you're properly compensated." The table was silent. Outside, the river moved against the pilings below the restaurant with a sound like breathing, low and constant and indifferent to what was happening above it. Sarah became aware of several things at once: the heat in her face, the specific quality of the silence, the way Chloe's eyes were bright with something that was not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it, the way Mark was looking at his plate, looking at it with a focus so deliberate it could only mean he was working very hard not to look anywhere else. Tiffany reached into the folder beside her plate. She produced a personal check, the kind you write by hand on expensive checkbooks, and slid it across the white linen toward Sarah with 2 fingers. The same motion you might use to push a card across a table in a negotiation. "It's time for the real family to move on, Sarah," Chloe said. Her voice carried the particular cruelty of someone who has been rehearsing a line. "You understand, don't you?" Sarah looked at the check. She did not pick it up. She looked at Mark. He was still looking at his plate. The steak sat half-eaten in front of him, the knife resting across it at an angle. His jaw was set in the way it said when he was waiting for something uncomfortable to be over. He knew. The thought arrived not with shock but with the quiet, Terrible clarity of something that had been true for a long time before it was acknowledged. He had known about the POA. He had known about the withdrawal. And he had known about this. She looked at the check again. Then she looked at Eleanor. Eleanor held her gaze with the expression of a woman who believed she was being generous and expected gratitude for it. Those gray eyes, storm water gray, watching Sarah with the patient certainty of someone who had never in their life been told no by someone they considered below them. Sarah picked up the check with 2 fingers. She placed it back on the linen in front of Tiffany. Her chair scraped against the hardwood floor louder than she intended, louder than the room expected as she pushed it back. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant, and a few nearby tables glanced over. She stood. "I wasn't an employee," Sarah said. Her voice was steady. She had not planned for it to be steady, but it was, the way things sometimes are. In the moment that matters, when the body makes decisions the mind hasn't caught up to yet. "I was your daughter," she said it looking at Eleanor directly, and she watched Eleanor's face change, the warmth evaporating completely, those gray eyes cooling to something that was past cold, past ice, to the particular temperature of stone in winter. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Tiffany folded the check back into her folder with the brisk efficiency of someone concluding a transaction. Sarah took her small evening bag from the back of the chair. She didn't look at Mark again. She walked the length of the restaurant toward the exit with her back straight. And the candlelight warm on either side of her and the sound of her heels on the floor the only sound she was aware of. The host near the door smiled professionally as she passed. She did not smile back. Outside, the Brooklyn Bridge hung over the river in the summer night, enormous and indifferent, its lights reflected in the water below in long, broken columns. The taste of the expensive wine turned to ash in my mouth. She stood on the sidewalk and let the night air settle around her, warm and slightly humid, carrying the river smell that was always there beneath everything else in this city. Behind her, through the restaurant window, she could see the white linen of their table and the shape of her husband. Still sitting in his chair, still not looking up. She had left things in that house over 3 years the way anyone leaves things in a place. They keep returning to a spare set of scrubs hung on the hook behind the bathroom door in the guest suite, a charging cable coiled on the bedside table, 3 paperback novels on the shelf. She'd been meaning to finish a cardigan she'd left because the Hamptons were always 10 degrees colder than she dressed for. Small, practical things, the accumulated evidence of a life that overlapped with another life, arranged by proximity and habit. And the quiet assumption that tomorrow would look like today. She drove out to retrieve them on a Monday morning, 3 days after the River Cafe. Mark had not come home that night. He'd called the next morning brief, careful, the voice of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and still wasn't saying it cleanly to tell her. He was staying at his mother's for a few days, that they needed some space, that they would talk when things settled down. She had said, "All right," because she didn't know what else to say. Because the part of her that might have argued, that might have demanded something more, had gone quiet in the space between the restaurant and the sidewalk and hadn't come back yet. She turned the Volvo onto the gravel drive at 9:30 in the morning. She saw them from 50 yards out. Black trash bags, 6 of them, maybe 7, lined up on the brick driveway in a neat row like the kind of arrangement that had been made with deliberate care. Not thrown there, placed there. Her cardigan was visible through the thin plastic of the nearest one. The familiar gray cable knit pattern pressed against the dark bag like a face behind glass. Sarah pulled up and sat for a moment with the engine running. The fog had come off the sound in the night and hadn't fully lifted. It sat low over the property, muffling the birdsong, making the oak trees look like shapes cut from gray paper. The house rose behind the bags with its white facade and dark shutters, and on the front door she could see it from the car something had been taped. A document, white paper, multiple pages, the kind of formal adhesive tape that said this is official and intentional. She cut the engine. The fog dampened her hair the moment she stepped out of the car, That particular Hamptons moisture that wasn't quite rain, just the air being heavy with itself. She walked to the front door. The document was a reverse mortgage agreement. Eleanor's signature was at the bottom of each page, the ink dark and clear. Sarah read enough of it to understand what it was: a liquidation instrument. The house that Sarah had maintained and cleaned and kept functional for 3 years. Effectively being handed over to a lender. The equity extracted, the property converted to capital. It was, from a purely financial standpoint, a legitimate document. People signed these. It happened. What didn't usually happen was having it taped to your front door. She stood on the brick step and read it twice, the fog settling on her shoulders, and thought about all the mornings she had unlocked this door with her key. All the times she had stepped over the threshold, carrying groceries or medical supplies or the kind of quiet, practical energy that a household requires to function. She thought about the winter 2 years ago when the pipes had frozen in the East Wing and it had been Sarah who'd called the plumber at midnight and stayed until it was sorted, because Eleanor had been too exhausted from treatment to handle it herself. She thought about the garden she'd spent one October afternoon helping the groundskeeper with because Eleanor had wanted it done a certain way. And the groundskeeper hadn't understood what she meant. She tried the door. The key no longer worked. The lock had been changed. She stood on the step for another moment, her key in her hand, looking at the door. Then she walked back to the car, got in, and sat in the driver's seat with the door closed and the fog pressing against the windows and the row of black trash bags visible through the windshield. She opened her banking app. The joint account balance was $0. Not low, not nearly empty, 0, with a transaction timestamp from 2 days ago showing a full withdrawal, initiated from a device and location she didn't recognize. Sarah stared at the screen for a long time. The Volvo's heater was running, but it wasn't warming the car properly. It never had. The thermostat had been faulty for 2 years and she'd kept meaning to get it fixed. And it produced a low, coughing sound when it ran, like something trying very hard and not quite managing. She sat in the insufficient warmth of her faulty heater and looked at the zero balance and listened to the fog. On the passenger seat, beneath her bag, there was a manila envelope she'd picked up from the mailbox at their Queens apartment before she left that morning. Addressed to Sarah Miller Vance in a typeface she recognized as legal correspondence. She had not opened it yet. She opened it now. It was a guardianship application. Formal, filed, dated. She read the petitioner's name, Tiffany Elaine Vance, and then she read the grounds cited, and that was where her hands stopped cooperating. The respondent displays signs of emotional instability and demonstrates behaviors inconsistent with the sound judgment required for medical decision-making authority. Multiple witnesses can attest. She stopped reading. She put the application face down on the passenger seat. Outside, the fog sat on the property, and the black bags sat on the driveway, and the door, with its taped reverse mortgage document, sat at the end of the brick path, and everything was very still. Mentally unstable. They had written mentally unstable. They had taken the 3 years she had given this family, the midnight calls, the hospital stays, the pill organizers and the medical charts and the anniversaries she had not celebrated because Eleanor had needed her, and they had converted it, in legal language, into evidence of disorder. They had taken her dedication and made it pathology. They had taken her presence and made it threat. How did I become the villain in a story where I gave everything? The rain started then. Not gradually. The Hamptons' weather had never been subtle, but suddenly, the way it does on the coast when the pressure shifts one moment dry. Then all at once the windshield was running and the black bags on the driveway were darkening with moisture and the oak trees were shaking their crowns in the sudden wind. Sarah put both hands on the steering wheel. Not to drive, just to hold something solid. The scream came from a place she hadn't known existed, not from grief exactly, not from anger exactly, but from somewhere beneath both, from 3 years of compressed silence and managed professionalism. And the specific, accumulated weight of giving more than you should to people who were keeping a running account of what they would eventually take back. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, loud enough to fill the car, heard by no one. After it was over, she sat in the silence that followed with her hands still on the wheel and her breath coming in short, ragged intervals. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror. 46 years old, hair damp from the fog, eyes red at the edges, still in the blue dress from Friday because she hadn't gone back to properly changing yet, a detail that suddenly seemed important in a way she couldn't articulate. A nurse, head nurse of one of the most respected hospital systems in New York City. A woman who had managed a terminal diagnosis, a family estate, a complex medication regimen, and the emotional volatility of a woman who had never in her life been told the truth about herself. A woman who had done all of it without complaint, without recognition, without even the basic professional courtesy of being told when the terms of her arrangement had been changed. She sat with herself in the rearview mirror for a long moment. At 46, she thought, I finally learned that the only person who will save me is the one I see in this mirror. The rain came down harder. The bags on the driveway were fully soaked now, the black plastic shining. Her cardigan was in there. Her books. 3 years of small, accumulated presents. She started the car. The heater coughed to life. She put it in reverse and backed slowly down the gravel drive, the fog closing in behind the Volvo as she went, the house receding in the rearview until the oak trees swallowed it entirely, until all that was left was gray air and the sound of rain on the roof and the road opening up ahead of her. Friends, we're halfway through Sarah's story now, and what a journey it's been. She gave 3 years of herself to the Vance family. 3 years of early mornings, long drives, hospital vigils, and quiet sacrifices. And what did she get in return? A check slid across a restaurant table, a row of trash bags in a foggy driveway, a legal document calling her unstable. There's something about watching a person who has given everything be handed nothing that reaches right into the chest and squeezes. But here's what Eleanor, Tiffany, and Chloe don't know yet, and what Mark forgot the moment he chose that dinner table over his wife Sarah Miller. Is a trained professional with 20 years of experience, a clear mind, and nothing left to lose. The woman in that rearview mirror? She's just getting started. Stay with us. The second half of this story is where everything changes. The oncology ward at night had its own particular light. Sarah had worked in enough hospitals to know that each unit developed its own atmosphere over time, the particular rhythm of its monitors, the specific quality of its silence during the dead hours, the way the staff moved through the corridors. With the practiced quiet of people who understood that for the patients behind those doors, night was rarely restful. But oncology was its own thing. The blue-white of the monitors, the IV poles standing sentinel beside beds. The smell that was not quite antiseptic and not quite illness but something between the two, the smell of bodies being fought for. She had stayed in this ward for 48 hours straight, 2 years ago. It was not the most hours she had ever worked without proper rest. Nursing had given her several occasions that exceeded that, but it was the most she had ever given without it being required of her. Eleanor had developed a severe reaction to the third round of treatment. Her body staging what the oncologist described with careful clinical neutrality as a significant adverse event. The night charge nurse had called Sarah at 11:45. She had arrived by 1 in the morning. She had not left until the crisis passed. She sat now in the plastic chair beside the memory of that bed. She was in the community clinic in the Bronx where she had picked up double shifts, the fluorescent overhead. A different quality of light entirely. But memory is its own room, and she was sitting in both at once and let it play. Eleanor's hand in hers, the grip of it surprising, for such a precise and controlled woman, desperate, tight. The hand of someone who has run out of performance and arrived at the pure animal truth of fear. Don't leave me, Sarah. You're the only one who cares. A whisper with nothing managed about it. Just the voice. Sarah had stayed. She had not called Mark. She had thought about it briefly, in the second hour, when the worst of the crisis had stabilized and Eleanor was sleeping with the shallow, exhausted sleep of someone who had just had the stuffing knocked out of her, and then she had seen Eleanor's phone on the bedside table and noticed the screen. Missed calls from Tiffany. Not one, several, spanning a period of about 4 hours, the most recent timestamp from the middle of the surgery prep. She had picked up the phone, intending to call back, to let Tiffany know where her mother was and what was happening. She read the most recent voicemail notification preview. "Mom, it's me. I know you're probably busy, but I really need to talk to you about the Range Rover situation." Sarah had set the phone back down. She had returned to the chair beside Eleanor's bed, and she had sat through the rest of the night in the blue monitor light with the sound of the machines keeping their steady count, and she had not called Tiffany back. She had told herself, at the time, that this was a judgment call. That Eleanor was stable, that the message hadn't been urgent, that it would be handled in the morning. She had told herself this with the particular conviction of someone who knows they are choosing a comfortable interpretation over an accurate one. Sitting in the clinic now, 2 weeks after the River Cafe and 4 days after the driveway in the fog, she could see it more clearly. She had been stitching. That was what she had been doing for 3 years without naming it. Stitching the gaps in this family's fabric with her own silence, covering the absences, filling the spaces. Making the whole thing hold together by inserting herself into every crack and calling it care. The smell of the hospital returned to her as memory always returns such things, sudden and total, more vivid than reason can account for. The antiseptic, the particular warmth of a room where the ventilation never quite manages to clear the air completely. The sound of Eleanor breathing, labored but regular, the monitors confirming what her chest already told her. Still here. Still here. Still here. I mistook her fear for love, Sarah thought. And her need for a bond. She wrote that down. Not in a journal. She had never kept a journal, had always thought of them as instruments of self-indulgence. She didn't have time for, but on a notepad she kept at the clinic desk for exactly this kind of thinking. The kind that needed to leave the body before it calcified. She wrote it down and looked at it. Fear is not love. Need is not belonging. A hand reaching out in the dark is not an invitation to stay in the dark permanently. She had confused the intensity of a crisis with the intimacy of a relationship. She had let Eleanor's vulnerability in the worst moments stand in for Eleanor's regard in the ordinary ones. And Eleanor had known exactly what she was doing. Perhaps not consciously. Perhaps not with the cold deliberation that Tiffany and Chloe brought to everything, but in the way that people who have always had power know how to use the people around them without ever examining the transaction clearly. The clinic's waiting room was audible through the thin wall, the low murmur of voices, a child's occasional cry. The particular shuffling patience of people waiting for care they couldn't easily access elsewhere. Sarah had been working here for 10 days. Double shifts, cash in hand arrangements while the legal situation sorted itself out. The kind of work that a head nurse technically overqualified for, but that she had found, unexpectedly, grounding. The patients here needed what she knew. They didn't need it performed or managed or delivered with the particular choreography of a family managing its image. They just needed it. She tore the page from the notepad and folded it. Through the small window above the desk, the Bronx afternoon was doing what it always did, dense with people and movement. And the particular alive quality of a neighborhood that didn't have the luxury of stillness. Somewhere down the block, someone's radio was playing a song she half recognized. She uncapped her pen and pulled a fresh page toward her. There was something she needed to check. The NYP patient portal notification arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, small and blue on her phone screen. The automated kind that the system generated without human intervention, a reminder, technically, about a proxy access account that had not been formally revoked. The hospital's administrative system was thorough in many ways and imperfect in others. And this was one of the imperfections. Sarah's proxy credentials for Eleanor Vance's medical records, granted 3 years ago and never removed. She had not thought about it since the morning she'd left the Hamptons for the last time. She looked at the notification for a long time without opening it. The clinic was between patients. The corridor outside her small office was quiet. The particular mid-afternoon lull before the after-school crowd arrived with their ear infections and sports injuries. Sunlight came through the window at a low angle. catching the dust motes that moved through the air above her desk with the slow, unconcerned drift of things that owe no one anything. She opened the app. Her credentials still worked. The most recent upload to Eleanor Vance's file was a radiology report, timestamped 4 days ago. Originating from the imaging center Eleanor's oncologist used in Southampton. Sarah opened it. She read it the way she read everything medical, quickly, without drama. The trained eye moving to the relevant sections and extracting what was there before the rest of the mind caught up. She had been reading scan reports for 20 years. She knew the language. She knew where the important information lived on the page and what it looked like when it was bad. It was bad. A shadow on the tail of the pancreas. The radiologist's notes were careful. Radiology reports always were careful and hedged and clinical, but Sarah could read between the hedging with the precision of long practice. The density, the location, the comparison to the prior imaging that showed nothing in the same region. The notation clinical correlation recommended on an urgent basis. The asterisk beside the measurement. Recurrence. Stage 4. Aggressive. She sat with the report on her screen and the afternoon sunlight on her desk and let the information be what it was. Her phone buzzed. A ring notification, the smart home doorbell system that was still connected to her app. Because the family had, in their haste to reorganize everything, forgotten to remove her from the linked devices. She opened it reflexively, the way you open things that buzz without thinking about it first. The live feed from the front door camera of the Hamptons estate showed a limousine in the driveway. She could see the timestamp in the corner, early afternoon, just hours after the radiology report had been uploaded. Tiffany was directing luggage to the trunk with the brisk authority she directed everything. Chloe was in a wide-brimmed hat, the kind you wear for a European vacation. Eleanor was being helped into the back seat by the driver, moving slowly. But not, from what Sarah could see, like someone who had any idea what her most recent scan had said. A cruise. They were leaving for a cruise. Sarah watched the tiny screen as the limo doors closed and the vehicle moved slowly down the gravel drive toward the road. The camera held the empty driveway for a moment. The fog was gone today. The morning sharp and clear, the oak trees casting clean shadows, and then the motion sensor stopped triggering and the feed went dark. She set the phone face down on the desk. The radiology report was still open on it when she turned it back over. She thought about calling. She thought about this with genuine deliberateness, not performing the consideration for some imagined audience, but actually sitting with it, rolling the decision over and looking at it from different angles, the way she had been taught to approach medical ethics cases in her training. Who has the duty? What is the obligation? What does care require? They called me a stranger. Tiffany had used that word, or something functionally equivalent to it, the real family. The implication of it had been precise and intentional. You are not family. You are outside the circle. You have no standing here. And then they had filed legal documents arguing she was mentally unstable. And they had taped a contract to a front door. And they had slid a check across a restaurant table as though 3 years could be settled like a bill. A stranger has no duty to warn. The thought arrived with a clarity that surprised her. A legal and ethical precision she had not known she was building toward until it was already formed. Medical proxy access was not the same as medical responsibility. Her credentials were a clerical oversight, not a standing obligation. She had been removed from this family systematically, deliberately, legally, and she had the paperwork to prove it. She reached for the printout she had made when the report first loaded. The clinic's shredder was in the corner. A small cross-cut model that handled maybe 5 sheets at a time. The kind of machine that did its work quickly and without ceremony. She fed the pages in. The machine ran for perhaps 8 seconds. The paper came out the other side in thin strips. The density of the scan reduced to fragments. The radiologist's careful language turned to confetti. Sarah watched it fall into the collection bin. For once, she thought, the room very quiet around her. The afternoon light still warm on the desk, the shredder finishing its work with a small mechanical click. The silence didn't feel like a burden. She reached for her notepad. There were things she needed to look up. An attorney she had the name of but hadn't called yet. The specific legal language around unpaid professional medical services and lien filings against estates. The whistleblower protections for reporting insurance fraud through hospital, HR channels, and the evidence she had already, without knowing she was gathering it, accumulated over 3 years of careful record keeping. It felt like power. She pulled her legal notepad toward her, uncapped her pen, and began. 2 weeks to the day after the crew's departure, Sarah received a call from Mark. She almost didn't answer. She was between patients at the clinic, the afternoon busy in the way Wednesdays always were. And his name on her screen produced the particular complicated response of something that had once meant a great deal and had since been reduced to logistics. But she answered. His voice was different from the last time she'd heard it, the careful, rehearsed quality gone, replaced with something rougher and less managed. He told her that the cruise had been cut short after the 3rd day. That Eleanor had become ill on the ship, that she was back at the Hamptons estate, that the situation was serious, that the doctors were coming to the house because Eleanor was refusing the hospital. She keeps asking for you, Mark said. Sarah said, I understand. She hung up. She sat for a moment in the plastic chair at her desk and looked at the wall. The clinic's afternoon sounds moved around her, the waiting room, a child, the low murmur of the examination rooms, and she felt, with considerable precision, the particular weight of being asked to return to a fire you had finally walked out of. She called her attorney from the hallway. She arrived at the Vance estate on a Thursday afternoon in late August, when the Hamptons light was the particular gold of the season's end, the oak trees beginning their slow shift toward amber. She drove the familiar gravel drive and parked in the same spot she had parked in for 3 years. But she did not use her key, because she no longer had a key that worked. She rang the bell. Tiffany answered the door. She looked like she had not slept. The champagne-colored jacket was gone. She was in clothes that suggested she had been wearing them for a day already, her usually precise hair slightly undone. Behind her, through the foyer, Sarah could see the marble floor of the entryway and, on it, a scattered series of documents, insurance papers, from the look of them, and medical invoices that had the particular density of serious numbers. The sisters had not, it turned out, known Eleanor's dosages. They had not known which doctor to call or which pharmacist held the standing prescriptions, or what the protocol was when Eleanor's anti-nausea medication stopped working at 3 in the morning and something else was needed. They had not known how to read the portable monitor Sarah had helped select or how to interpret the oxygen saturation numbers it produced. They had not known these things because they had never been the ones to learn them. Sarah had. She won't let the hospital doctors help her, Tiffany said. The performance was gone entirely now. The gallery owner composure stripped back to something more basic. She says she only trusts you. Sarah looked at her steadily. I know, she said. She walked through the foyer, past the scattered insurance papers, up the stairs she had climbed thousands of times. The master bedroom door was open. Eleanor was in her bed, diminished in the way that this disease diminished people, not immediately, not all at once, but in increments that accumulated until one day the subtraction became visible. She was smaller than she had been a month ago. Her hands on the coverlet were thin, but her eyes, when they found Sarah in the doorway, were still sharp, still that storm water gray, still watching. Sarah. Her voice was a rasp, but it was hers. Chloe stood near the window, looking at her phone, then not looking at her phone, then looking out at the garden with the particular helpless restlessness of someone who did not know what to do with their hands when there was nothing to arrange. Mark stood near the door. Sarah did not look at him for long. She crossed to the bed, checked Eleanor's color and her breathing with the automatic precision of reflex, noted several things she would have managed differently over the past 2 weeks, and then she turned. Tiffany had followed her upstairs and stood in the doorway. Sarah reached into the leather portfolio she was carrying and produced a document. She stepped toward Tiffany and held it out. Today, the judge dismissed your guardianship claim, Sarah said. Her voice was the voice she used in the hospital when she delivered information that required someone to understand it. Clearly and immediately steady, direct, carrying no apology. The application was rejected on grounds that the cited behaviors were professionally documented as competent and responsible medical conduct. My attorney submitted the records this morning. Tiffany looked at the court order. Her face moved through several expressions without settling on any of them. And, Sarah continued, I've filed a lien against this estate for 3 years of unpaid professional medical services. The amount has been calculated at the standard rate for a private medical consultant with my credentials and experience. Your family's attorney has been notified. Chloe made a sound from the window. Mark was very still near the door. Eleanor's hand moved on the coverlet, trembling slightly, reaching in the direction of where Sarah stood. Sarah, the rasp again, something in it that was different from the voice she'd used in the restaurant. Smaller, more exposed. Please, I'm scared. Sarah looked at the hand. She looked at Eleanor's face. She thought about the oncology ward and the blue light of the monitors and the hand gripping hers in the dark. She thought about 48 hours straight. She thought about the anniversary she hadn't celebrated and the pill organizer and the frozen pipes in the East Wing. And the document in the wastebasket and the check slid across the white linen and the row of black trash bags on the fog-soaked driveway and the words mentally unstable on a legal filing with her name on it. She stepped back. I'm sure your real family will handle it, Eleanor, she said. The words were quiet, not cruel. She hadn't intended cruelty, had in fact spent some time with her attorney working out what she was and wasn't willing to do and had made her decisions clearly. Simply honest. The same measured, clinical delivery she had been trained to use for information that was difficult but true. After all, she said, I'm just a stranger. She turned to Tiffany with the even efficiency of a professional completing a transaction. The hospital's HR director has been in contact with the insurance fraud division regarding the billing irregularities I reported. My documentation goes back 2 years. If you have questions about the lien, here is my attorney's contact information. She placed a card on the dresser by the door. She looked at Mark once. Just once. He was looking back at her now finally. Fully, with the expression of a man who had made a choice a long time ago and was only now experiencing its complete weight. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she moved toward the door. The dosage for the anti-nausea medication is on the chart I've left with your family physician, she said. To no one in particular. To all of them, to the room. He has my number if there are medical questions. For a referral fee. She walked down the stairs. The foyer was exactly as she had found it, the scattered insurance papers, the marble floor. The afternoon light coming through the tall windows in long, warm bands. The same foyer she had walked through 1,000 times in a coat and scrubs, carrying a medical bag, on her way to someone else's crisis. She walked out the front door. The oak trees at the end of the drive were beginning to turn. The ink on the legal documents felt more permanent than any promise they ever made. The office was on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown that had been renovated sometime in the last decade. Floor-to-ceiling windows, clean lines. The kind of space that felt both professional and genuinely inhabitable, which was a combination Sarah had not appreciated fully until she found herself looking for it. She had spent 3 months securing it, the sublease negotiations, the licensing paperwork for a private medical consultancy, the small but significant bureaucratic work of establishing herself as a solo practitioner. With 20 years of hospital experience and a very clear sense of what she was and wasn't willing to do, she opened the door for the first time as a business owner on a Tuesday morning in October. The oak trees in Central Park, visible from her window at the right angle, were at peak color. Amber and rust and a deep, saturated gold that the city got exactly once a year and that New Yorkers, for all their cultivated indifference to spectacle, always noticed. She stood at the window for a moment and let herself notice it. 47 years old. She set her bag down on the clean desk, the surface empty and expectant in the way of beginnings. The morning sun came through the glass at a low angle and fell across her hands where they rested on the desk's edge. warming them completely, the kind of warmth that reaches the skin and keeps going. She had caught the news report on her phone during the car service uptown. A brief item, tucked between a mayoral announcement and a weather update, about the Vance estate in the Hamptons being placed in receivership to cover a combination of outstanding medical debts, legal fees, and the lien that had been filed and subsequently upheld against the property. Eleanor's experimental treatments. There were several, the family having consulted specialists after the European cruise situation, each consultation generating its own invoice, had not been covered by the insurance policy that Tiffany had apparently been managing with some creative accounting. The HR director at NYP had been thorough in her response to Sarah's whistleblower report. The insurance fraud investigation had moved with a speed that surprised even Sarah's attorney. She closed the news app. Mark was gone. That was the accurate word for it, not dramatically absent, not bitterly estranged, but simply gone, his presence receding from her life the way a figure recedes in a rearview mirror, growing smaller with distance until it disappears at the curve. She thought of him sometimes, still the way you think of a place you used to live, with a combination of genuine memory and the mild detachment of someone who has moved on and understands that the moving on was right. He had made his choice at that restaurant table, or perhaps earlier. Perhaps long before, and she had eventually stopped trying to locate the exact moment and simply accepted the shape of what it had produced. She had spoken to a therapist twice a month for the past 3 months. This was not something she had announced to anyone, but it was something she had decided for herself, quietly, as part of the larger project of becoming honest about what the last 3 years had cost her and what she intended to reclaim. The first client consultation was at 10 o'clock. A hospital administrator from a private clinic in Connecticut, who had been referred by a colleague, looking for help navigating a complex family medical power of attorney situation. Sarah had read the intake materials twice. She knew exactly what questions to ask. But before that, she had one other obligation. The group met on Monday evenings in a conference room she rented by the hour at a co-working space 6 blocks from the new office. 6 women. Currently she had started with 3. And it had grown through word of mouth, the quiet kind of word of mouth that travels through certain professional circles. All nurses, all at various stages of similar situations, undervalued, overlooked, told that their expertise was a service rather than a profession, that their investment of time and skill and genuine care was something that could be compensated with a check and dismissed with a 2-sentence email. She had not set out to mentor them. It had happened the way useful things sometimes happened, naturally, because the need was there and she was the person standing in front of it. She thought about the night 2 months ago when one of them, a woman named Priya, 38, ICU experience, currently in a wage dispute with a private family she'd been caring for, had said, "But isn't this just what we do? Isn't this what caring looks like?" And Sarah had looked at her across the conference table, and thought about every version of herself that had asked the same question and accepted the wrong answer. Caring is a profession, she had said. Document everything, invoice everything, and never, ever mistake someone's need for you with their regard for you. They are not the same thing. Priya had written it down. Sarah sat at her desk now in the October morning light and signed the new client contract, her signature clear and unhurried at the bottom of the page. Sarah Miller, medical consultant. Not Miller Vance. She had gone back to Miller with the paperwork completed and the legal name change processed 2 weeks ago. And the first time she had signed something with the old name, she had noticed, with slight surprise, that it fit better than she remembered. She set the pen down. She breathed. The city moved below and around her, the particular, constant, absolutely indifferent motion of New York going about its business, which had always been, she thought, one of its great mercies. It did not require your participation. It did not need you to be performing anything in particular. It simply moved, and you moved in it, and that was enough. The morning sun was warm on her hands. For the first time in a very long time, she was not carrying anything that wasn't hers. No one else's crisis to manage. No one else's fear to absorb. No one else's family dynamics to stitch together from the inside. Just the clean, uncomplicated weight of her own life, her own choices, her own name on the contract she was about to build something from. At 47, I finally learned that starting over isn't failure, it's freedom. The words had arrived one evening in her apartment while she was making dinner. Unannounced and complete, and she had recognized them as the kind of truth that takes a long time to grow and arrives all at once when it's ready. She hadn't written them down immediately. She had let them sit in the room with her while she cooked, testing their weight, and they had held. She pulled the first client file toward her and opened it. The morning sun moved across the desk as the hour turned, warming the paper under her hands, warming the window glass, warming the room and the skyline and the trees in the park below. Where the October colors were at their absolute peak, brief and vivid and entirely, irreplaceably themselves. She began to read. Friends, how did you find today's story? Sarah Miller gave 3 years of her life to a woman who called her an employee. She gave her expertise, her time, her anniversary, her sleep. She gave the kind of attention that cannot be faked, the kind that comes from genuinely caring. Whether someone lives or dies, and she gave it to a family that was quietly preparing, the whole time, to hand her a check and show her the door. And still she walked away not as a victim, but as a woman who had learned something irreplaceable about the difference between need and love, between presence and belonging. There's a lesson in Sarah's story that I think many of us carry quietly, especially those of us who were taught that giving more was always the right answer. That if we just worked harder, stayed longer, asked for less, the people we were giving to would eventually recognize what they had. But the truth Sarah had to learn the hard way, and that she now teaches to the women in her Monday evening group, is this: your expertise is not your affection. Your time has a value that exists whether or not someone chooses to honor it. And the person who benefits most from your care is not always the person most worth caring for. What Eleanor Vance feared most was not cancer. It was being alone. And what she could never admit was that she had surrounded herself with family and still managed to be entirely alone. Because she had never learned to see the people in front of her clearly. Sarah saw clearly. It just took her a while to trust what she saw. I hope this story brought you something meaningful today. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe it was permission to value your own time, to trust your own judgment, to understand that starting over at 47, or 57, or 67, is not a defeat. It is, as Sarah found out, freedom. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe and hit that like button. It means more than you know, and it helps us bring you stories like this one. We'll see you in the next one, friends. Take care of yourselves.